Welcome to Broadcast Interrupted. I'm Chirag, and with me, as always,
Andy,
so Andy, why don't you tell us who did we interrupt in this episode?
in this week's episode, we interrupted Rupali Gupte. She's an architect, an artist, and an urbanist based in Mumbai. She is one of the founding members of the School of Environment and Architecture in Mumbai, and also a partner, which is an architecture and a research-based architecture firm that she runs along with Prasad Shetty. Um, Chirag, you have to tell me what you thought of this very, very, very rich conversation. How would you summarize it?
Well, I know Rupali since a really long time now. She taught me at architecture school, and focus especially on this conversation. I thought the most interesting aspect, or like one way to sum up this conversation, would be just her just the way in which she speaks about architecture, which is which includes vocabulary which is not, let's say, part of native to architectural
Yeah.
discourse. Yeah. What I thought she does very interestingly through her work is that she not only does she work with all the stakeholders that are involved when it comes to urban scale projects, research projects that concern the city, but also she includes or makes conscious attempts at identifying new stakeholders or who could be a person who should be or a stakeholder that should be brought on board to have a conversation. She keeps reimagining these structures, and I think that is intrinsic to her work and also important aspect of her work.
Yeah.
I mean, if we look at all her projects, the glossaries that she works on, and uh, those are terms that we as architects are not very familiar. We don't use them in discourse so often. And I thought that formed pretty much the crux of our conversation with her.
Yeah, you're referring to the part of our conversation where she tells us about her research on Gurgaon and why the research is called Sorry, actually. Yeah, it makes her sort of approach to cities is very refreshingly meaningful. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The way she expresses those thoughts also in that research and informal terms. Yeah, great.
So, well, I think when it comes to the introduction, we keep it short and sweet and let our viewers and listeners find out through the conversation what all we discussed. As always, we covered a lot of ground. It is a long conversation. Please stay with us. It will be released in two parts. But yeah, most importantly, let us know what you think. Thanks.
Hi, Rupali. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with us. We're very, very happy to have you. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Without um, uh, expressing how much we miss Mumbai, could you tell us what Mumbai feels like today?
Today, it's nice outside. It's kind of sunny. Weather is very nice. And yeah, I wish you guys were here and not on the screen. But yeah, this is great. This is great to have this conversation across. I can see the light in your place is it's quite similar to mine. So that's why we're connecting here.
We have a match.
Yeah.
And how has it been these days in Mumbai? Right from, let's say, COVID sort of slowing down, and what does it feel like these days in the city?
Yeah, I think the energy is back. I hope the COVID cases don't rise. Things have, they're coming back in some ways. I would say to normal. Let's see. Just hope that it's really, really hope the third wave doesn't hit us, because I think the second wave just took us completely by surprise. I would say we were not prepared for it at all. But let's just hope I mean, I think it's the same all over the world, right? Like
Yeah.
multiple waves coming in. But in some ways, life seems to have moved on in many ways. And yeah, let's just hope it doesn't come back to hit us hard.
And are you back at school and in your lab and in your studios?
Yeah, so we've started. So the thing is that, right, like with COVID, many things changed for us. In some ways, and we also did actually from the school. We did this project called the COVID Glossaries, and in some ways to get a sense of what was happening around us, because things were so close to us that we really didn't we didn't have a way of making any sense out of it. It's like we always say, it's like Salman Rushdie's in Midnight's Children. When he talks about the idea of the contemporary being like watching cinema, with your cheek to the screen, and all you're seeing is pixels, because you don't have that critical distance to see things through, right? So in some ways it was like that for us, but we said, if it's this way, then maybe we should have 200 people seeing this contemporary together, where each one is seeing each pixel, and telling each other the stories of these pixels, to in some ways start, piecing this picture together for us collectively. And that's what we did in the school. And we, in some ways, what we then figured is that, many things are changing. In some ways, perhaps it's not possible to go back to the same way of thinking of institutions, the same ways of working. Look at us, we are still, it's post-COVID, but we are also still, talking on the Zoom, having this conversation. So in some ways, we felt like it was important to also rethink the way, institutions work, the way, transactions happen. So there's a lot that we also learned from the last 1.5 years, which we think is important to bring into the way we continue our lives now as well. So we've also decided that it's possible to do hybrid conversations. You can have lectures, you can have large assemblies online. We continue to meet people from all around the world. So I think that kind of exchange is very, very rich and is important. So that's how, I don't think it's gone back to what we started off like a year and a half ago, but it's bringing in a lot of this learning, to really kind of, and so many things. The idea of the home, for example, was completely questioned, right? Like suddenly there was
Everyone
this
had way too much time to evaluate.
Yeah, but also in some ways there was this announcement that said, lock yourselves into your homes. And a lot of us realized that home, some people didn't have homes to be locked into, right?
Yeah.
Some people, realized that the home wasn't that safe a space. So in some ways, really, it was important to rethink this idea of the home that we also began with, So I think there's a lot of learning to do from what we have, got over the year and a half. And I think that has to also continue in the post-COVID, questioning that we sort of build for ourselves.
And what were the kind of categories that you recorded in COVID glossaries? You spoke about that briefly.
Right. So I said, like, for example, the idea of the home, like perhaps we need to rethink this propertied idea of the home. And maybe there are other ways of thinking of homes. Maybe homes more as networks, the idea of extended ideas of the home, where, neighborhoods become homes, cities become home. Also the idea of institutions. What does it mean to think of an institution exactly? Like, I think before we started the conversation, you guys were talking about setting up this thing for yourselves. So are there ways in which you can think of post-institutional formations, more spaces for autodidactic learning,
Yeah.
One in some ways. I mean, you guys, the space that you've built is an autodidactic space, because you are continuing to learn, right?
Yeah.
So instead of creating the space of the institution as a space of discipline, because then you tend to discipline bodies, rather than that, can you create more conducive environments for people to become autodidacts?
Yeah.
So similarly, I think the idea of solidarities, for example, right? So the way solidarities actually created multiple ways of engaging, where our health systems failed, governance systems failed in many ways. It was these small solidarities that held things together, right? So is it possible to think of new institutions through these ideas of solidarities? So I think there was a lot of learning. This idea of the new sensoriums, like the techno sensorium, for example, right? Like, what does it mean, or to talk to each other, to kind of expand that kind of post educational space through multiple techno sensoriums. So, for example, the old ideas of say museums or educational institutions and other things might change completely. So there may be, and this is something where, for example, you have perhaps possibilities of more agile frameworks, right? Less capital intensive frameworks to get established, right? And so, because otherwise those capital intensive frameworks also create monopolies, right? You have the means in the hands of very few, but the possibilities of spreading out, creating more democratic frameworks of knowledge creation are much more possible. And it's not like this technology wasn't there before, right?
Yes,
But
yes. I was,
with COVID, we all realize, hey, this is possible, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
I think
yeah.
there's a lot to kind of think of, in rethinking the idea of homes, and rethinking idea of institutions, in rethinking ideas of sensoriums and possibilities of publics. So I
Yeah.
think, I mean, I can send you a link for the COVID glossary. There's a
Please.
whole, there's the glossary itself. There was an exhibition that we did. There was also a performance with students and some of us that then went to a literature festival as well after that. So
Nice.
Yeah.
I can share some of that with you.
Yeah, that'll be great. And it was very interesting that you mentioned that, this technology was there even before COVID hit. But what COVID kind of accelerated is this very sort of, I would say, violent or not, I don't know, but like just placing of this framework, like this aesthetic of the Zoom call being a form of conversation for podcasters. Because this podcast is not a podcast without Zoom or other such spaces to have these kind of conversations. And I think you're very right when you say that technosensorium. I think that's a little very interesting.
It also actually breaks the tendency of such technologies to consolidate their sort of cultural domain. Like there was a time when only these kinds of things are popular or widely accepted on Instagram. Only these kinds of things are widely accepted on YouTube
Yeah.
as cultural artifacts, and the pandemic really broke that open with people having time and sort of the whole, let's say, not in sort of capital terms, but in social capital terms, and a totally new economy of eyeballs opened up where everyone that wasn't being paid attention to, let's say, everything that wasn't being paid attention to, including, like you mentioned, the home, began to
Yeah.
be foregrounded, let's say. And I wanted to ask you this. So among as we were speaking earlier, that you're interested in asking these what you call first questions, and in this case, would you say one, very simply, it just popped into my head, would be how to observe a pandemic? Would it be because the observation and the, let's say, the act of recording the effects of a pandemic itself have to be very, very uh, maybe not carefully thought of, but one has to be conscious of how one records or observes a pandemic, right? As an architect or a, what do you think you had to sort of pay attention to?
Yeah, so exactly, right? Like I think what is important is to pay attention to what is currently happening around you, your like what is the contemporary in some ways, right?
Mm-hmm,
uh,
mm-hmm.
and the pandemic really created a completely, it overthrew everything, all our frameworks of sort of behaving, of acting, of kind of sensing, right? There were certain frameworks through which we led our lives, right? And they
Right.
changed completely. So our contemporary was changing completely. And
Yeah.
for us, it's important to kind of start understanding where we are going, to be able to kind of project futures from here. Because often what happens is we get caught into certain frameworks of working, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
without trying to understand where is it that we're coming from and where is it that we're going, right? And I think it's important for us to get a sense of that. And that's really, I mean, I think for academia, I think that's something that is super, super important, that you really kind of have to be in the forefront of that, to kind of make sense of the world, to be able to then, possibly change tracks and not get congealed into certain formulas of kind of, thinking of certain things from within your own disciplines, or even leading lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so this obviously, like you mentioned, has an effect on the academic studio space, or even sort of um, the cafes that you go to and speak to your artist or other professional friends. And it has a kind of it's a disruption, but at the same time people are trying to sort of let their inner subvertive tendencies come out and still do what they like doing. While we saw a lot of balcony singing in Europe during the lockdowns.
Hmm.
And how do you think this compares, this kind of the tendency to uh, continue trying to do what we wish to, or how we wish to engage with society, compares to what you study in your work when it comes to observing Mumbai in your practice? Like a little bit more general. I know it's a little bit of a long-winded question, but um Mumbai has this characteristic of doing things in spite of it being difficult,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the pandemic shows another side of it. Have you found anything in your sort of latent thoughts that point towards any big differences?
So I'll tell you what I mean. One of the things that kind of also opened up for us is, like I can give you an example, from the pandemic, and say the idea of the home that we just spoke about,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So for example, uh, and this is where I say that, often what happens is that we get our frameworks of thinking, come from certain givens, which, and that's something that we've been arguing, that our ways of understanding cities come from these two disciplines, cartography and statistics,
Mm-hmm.
statistical ethnography.
Yeah.
And what those two disciplines have given us is these two tools of the map and the statistic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, for example, these, for us, I mean, that's what we've been arguing, that these two tools are limiting in the way they understand life. All
Mm-hmm.
right. So to give you an example, what a map would require is clear boundaries, right? It will require clear boundaries. So if boundaries are fuzzy, they're corroded, it will not start making any sense. For
Right.
statistics, you have to simplify things. You have to simplify data. So if things are complex, they will not make sense. Okay, I'll give you a few examples. The other thing that maps and statistics do is, in some ways, they don't allow experiential ways of thinking of space. Okay, because you need to quantify, you need to simplify, and they also create certain moralities of space. What is
Yeah.
standard, what is good, yeah, what is best practice, or also kind of clear separations between what is inside and outside, what is public and private. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the pandemic showed you something else completely. So, for example, we were visiting this house in a chawl, very
Mhm.
very beautiful place in this in South Bombay. It's
Mhm.
called Zaubawadi. Okay, the
Okay.
house itself is really small. Okay, it's there are two tenements, two rooms connected to each other, one
Uh-huh.
tenement, and there is a corridor in the front with series of bridges that connect. One, it's like there's a courtyard in the center.
Okay.
Okay, and bridges that connect, and very very beautiful because you find people are spending time on the bridges, and the whole house in some ways, this whole building becomes one house. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and similarly, there's another one that I went to called Punawala Chawl. And what happens again, this house, again, it's there two rooms, one in front of the other. There's a corridor on in one side, there's a corridor on the other side. So the house itself is a porous entity.
Yeah.
Right.
You can actually walk from one corridor to the next corridor, right? And one of those houses that we went to, there was a old couple that was living there, and this gentleman was ill for more than 3 years. you know
Mhm.
but it was possible for him to exist like that because of that urban form, because the
Right.
house was a porous entity, because people would come in and out, and they had guests visiting, people from the building would visit them. And in some ways it is because of that, like for example, in the absence of state sponsored social security, this
Mhm.
form
Yeah.
becomes that kind of idea of social security. And there
Yeah.
was a I often kind of quote this. There's a very interesting detail of the kitchen cabinet in this house, this the Punawala Chawl. The kitchen cabinet, which has a door, and that same door also shuts the main door.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
also acts as the main door. And through the day, the shutter of the kitchen cabinet is closed, and in the night it's the same cabinet door that goes and becomes the main door that shuts the outside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that sense it kind of remains porous through the day. It's only in the night that you require security and this place closes. And it's kind of like the artist Duchamp had
Yeah.
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
Yeah.
detail.
And
There was a
Yeah.
door that kind of closed two spaces, and there's a very completely everyday space here which is doing that. And somebody who's
this
kind of
is
almost
Yeah.
creating artist,
amazing.
yeah,
Chirag
amazing
and I, we
artist
talk. We call this
installation.
aestheticized function.
Yeah. I mean,
I mean, yeah, it's a kind of way of life, no?
yeah.
And that's really what completely gets missed out in these two. The map and the statistic misses this out completely. And so, to give you an example, the census, data tells us that 57% houses in Mumbai are one-room tenements. All right. Now, when you quote a statistic like that, automatically it means you need more houses, right? And so you would then say, okay, no, now we need more houses. Now how do you get it? State has no money. So then what do? You facilitate developers, right? You increase the FSI, you get more building rights for the to subsidize houses. And then you'll end up getting what we see around us, these crazy, like there's redevelopment happening everywhere. So you have slum rehabilitation, you have rehabilitation of old buildings which suddenly become these towers, which loses that kind of urban form that we spoke about, right? They
Yeah.
become
Mm-hmm.
isolated apartments, so there's no form of security at all, right? Security is seen as the CCTV camera security,
Yeah.
as opposed to the kind of social security that
Security.
other form afforded, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
This is because we are not experientially understanding these spaces at all. We are seeing them through the narrow frameworks of the statistic and the map from a cartographic point of view, right? So one of these people in Zawawadi actually told me, we could live in the pandemic, through the pandemic, because we had a house like this, because we were not confined to the home, because the neighborhood was the home, the whole building was the home,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's and they are looking at the redevelopment buildings around them. They're saying, we may get slightly bigger spaces, but it will not be the same space. I mean, it will not be a space I can call a home because I do not have all these extended possibilities, right? So I think that's something that gets completely missed out, that the experiential ways of thinking of space the ways of starting to, for example, we said it's really the idea of the public and the private completely get separated, right? Because you have this apartment. In this case, the public and the private is really kind of mixed up, right?
Yeah.
So when you require privacy, it's possible. You can close the door, you can create the space of your own, but it's possible to become part of the entire building at some point, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's important, and that's where we kind of come from, that it's important to change the frameworks, because it almost seems like it's the obvious. No, if you quote something like that, 57% people live in one room tenements. You're not looking at the experiential logics. Immediately, it leads to the next step and the next step, right? And that's where you're getting this environment around you, which is completely lacking any kind of social life, right? All these buildings that you're seeing around us,
or at least social life as is known by the city. And what surprises us, and your work really brings this out all the time, is that a place like Mumbai should always at least have a reaction to this on a social level. Like we as architects have how could we think that because we grew up in these homes, didn't we, some of us? And we have always considered this sort of a cleanup to be it's not gentrification, it's modernity. And but it's some in some ways there hasn't been much of a reaction to even in terms of when we consider redevelopment, right? Redevelopment has a tendency, we were talking about this, that when one apartment building in a neighborhood is approached, we're talking about just the gossip, it spreads like wildfire. People try to go and pay very high prices to residents who have don't know that this redevelopment might or might not happen for that particular apartment building, but there's this push for consolidation of property, and you can see sort of capitalization of that happening so much faster and so aggressive, that I don't know what design might be able to do in these within these sort of dynamic happenings, let's say. How do you see this? Because is it just a matter of policy, or do you see it as a matter of pedagogy?
yeah. So I think, there are a couple of things. Like, for example, one thing is that though it may appear like that things are happening so fast, actually, if you look at on the ground, they're not happening that fast. There are lots of projects which are on the crux of things. There's not enough. There's so many houses that are unsold. There's a kind of speculative bubble almost, right? So these are not spaces for living so much as for speculation. But on the other hand, and this is again something that we've been arguing, that because we think of the this idea that like the statistic actually tells us that you require so many homes, you suddenly realize that you require that this is the gap between that statistic, for that statistical imagination, the gap between the demand and the supply currently, even after 20 years, and I'm talking about Mumbai, 20 years of active policy in all kinds of things, in rehousing old buildings, in slum redevelopment and all of that, in even public sector housing. The gap is so absurd that it will require 100 years to fill that gap. Okay, because the private developers, the market has been able to supply only so much, because it works with market logics, right? It only works when there is when you're able to make profit, a lot of profit, right? So it works in places of very high real estate. It works when you do not have multiple tenancies that are creating
Clashing.
complexity in that kind of land itself. The titles have to be clear. And titles are never clear because there are all of these multiple claims, and that's how life is led, right? And
Yeah.
that's exactly what I'm telling you now, that modern logic requires this clarity. It requires to create clarity, you require muscle power. There's violence, you have to violently wipe out certain tenures to be able to create clear sort of titles. And that's when you will be able to build a building. But we don't see all of that as architects. You don't see that that's the violence that is going on to clean up and clarify land, right? So on the other hand, that's what we've been arguing, that A, to not have this violence, and B, to not have these absurd gaps. If you look again closely, and like the example I gave you, it's not that people are homeless. People have houses. There are multiple houses that are there. Is it possible to kind of look at, repairing and retrofitting, as an idea that, in some ways you work with the existing stock, and you start looking at other ways of thinking of home, where the home then becomes extended, like the example I gave you, right? If you start thinking of investing in places where, the neighborhood becomes home, the city becomes home. Why do we only think of home as this propertied space, the square meter? And that's all the fights happening today. You go to a cooperative housing society meeting, and people will fight for like 3 square feet of space. Make the wall smaller so that I get extra 3 square feet of space. But I think that's where this imagination is so limited. Of what I consider home is limited to the propertied idea of the home. I have whatever 50 square meter house, or I have 100 square meter house. That becomes the idea of the home that gets spoken about in popular circles, in our even when architects are speaking about it, they're talking about that idea of the home. But what we are doing often is we are conflating the idea of the house and the home. House is that property idea, but the home is much more than that, right? So is it possible to then work with logics where you're designing in ways that you're thinking of neighborhoods and cities becoming home as much as the houses? And for that, we need different frameworks of thinking itself.
And we found it very we went through the Bard Studio section about entrepreneurship. And how do you see because when we talk about these sort of the neighborhood becoming a home, obviously there are precedents of like community kitchens or sort of community spaces of different degrees of importance, right? Like we're talking nutrition, we're talking social security, like you said, or other such functions, let's say, that are to be housed, let's say. How do you see entrepreneurship within all this? Because this is something that is absolutely essential to be able to see the neighborhood as a home. It need not have its own sort of reinvention of the wheel, so to speak, of what a neighborhood needs to be, and then in that process sterilizing the idea and sort of cleaning up a very modern idea of what a neighborhood should be, and then boom, we have one big room as a community kitchen looking like a mess, like an army barracks, and then just dorms of people instead of this rich mix. And I think your so far, whatever we've come across in terms of Bard Studios work, uh, entrepreneurship has that. What drew you to thinking about it in those terms?
Yeah. So that's actually also so Bard Studio is the two of us, Prasad and me, and that was work that Prasad had started. And so I mean, in some ways, Bard Studio is also this kind of, like we said, it's an itinerant space, it's a nomadic space, and in some ways also kind of has this imagination of looking at a non-propertied, agile sort of practice, So Prasad's work was in, on entrepreneurship, and that's really sort of again very closely looking at what was happening post 90s. Post 90s, there was a dismantling in some ways, particularly in Mumbai. There was a dismantling of the economy. So like there was the mill worker, basically the mills kind of collapsed. The whole idea of industries, like we knew them, that were the backbone of the economy of the city, sort of collapsed. There's a kind of, in some ways, deindustrialization that was happening for all kinds of reasons. And what we realized that in post 90s, people were forced to become entrepreneurs. You no longer have the kind of security of a job that is structured. That it's not a 9 to 5 job anymore. These are the industries that were black boxes where all kinds of assembly and production would happen in one place, are now splintered.
Yeah.
Right? Textile mill that would have all of those functions in one place now will have it in different places. Right? It's so you don't have that kind of consolidated space, but you would have, say, a kind of one activity happening in another place, another activity happening in another place, the splintered form. But on the other hand, people had to also become entrepreneurs, because you have to now also compete with each other to kind of have that particular part of the production going, right? So, and this has happened post 90s. That's your economy today, right?
Yeah.
Now, what is important is to be cognizant of that, right? That if that is the case, if everybody has become entrepreneurs, then what should your city be like? What should your homes be like? The home will need to facilitate this. The neighborhood will need to facilitate this. The city will need to facilitate it. And often that's what happens. There is a kind of slippage in our ways of thinking where we don't understand. It's really kind of, when you think of the idea of what it is that you need for the future of cities, you kind of have, there's a template through which you work, modern ways of making cities, and that's what you will require. You require housing, and they come from these absurd statistics instead of looking at very, very closely as a fine grained kind of understanding of what is really happening.
Yeah.
And so that's what we are interested in a fine grained understanding, a fine grained looking at things, and from there trying to project what is it that space becomes, whether it's the space of the home, the institution, the city, right? So I think that's really, and that's what the entrepreneurship study was also about, that it was seeing that the city is becoming entrepreneurial, that people are becoming entrepreneurial.
Because it is uniquely also urban, right? Like when we talk about this, the sensing of urban form, I'll say something probably even silly, but I was always curious why pani puri, puchka, or golgappe have associations to a city. Like, how does a city invent a dish? Whatever it is, whether it is cuisine. And I'm going across crafts now because traditionally this happened. There was chicken curry, which is a kind of embroidery for our audiences. We're not talking about food here.
Yeah.
Or silk weaving in rural West Bengal, or other such crafts that have come out of what we would say, traditional crafts, things that take generations to develop and master. And there's this master shoe, in Germany, they say Meisterschule, which is, the skill needs to be passed down as almost as if it's classical music to each generation. And then cities sort of have this way of compressing that process also. Do you see it that when it comes to entrepreneurship?
Yeah, no, I think, well, I mean, you said something very interesting, that, cities have this, they generate new things, right? There's a certain sort of, almost sort of new languages, I mean, speaking of languages, that get kind of, built. And this is something that was important to us. We studied this, and that's where, we did this one project called the Gurgaon Glossary,
Mhm.
you know, and really kind of looking at the city of Gurgaon, which is on the periphery of Delhi, this new city that is growing, that is building. And in some ways there were, two binary sort of ways of looking at that city. One kind of was this gung ho, praise for this new city that is coming up, with
Full of potential.
full of potential
Infinity
and all of
and
that.
beyond.
Yeah. And then the other one was this kind of lament, that, oh, this is a decadent city, look, like no infrastructure, everyone has their own sort of infrastructure that they have to be building, based, completely unsustainable and all of that.
Yeah.
Now, what we decided, and that's where the glossary as a form becomes important, as opposed to the map and the statistic, because what it allowed you, we said, okay, let's for a moment suspend these two binaries, and live in that kind of operate in the space between these two binaries.
Mhm.
And so in that space, we came up with 100 terms that kind of happen when the city is settling, when the city is growing, and those terms, I mean, in that kind of project that we did, the terms were thick images and they were texts. Okay.
Ah.
And they opened up so many ways in which life is led, where there are so many more emancipatory potentials. Suddenly you found that there was, migrant housing that was happening in the villages, where the landlords actually had got a lot of money. They had made a lot of money because their farms were bought for these
For these
large
developments,
housing projects.
Yeah.
They had property in those houses. Now they had nothing to do, so they would set up these little shops, and they were landlord shops. So if you see the image, they look like really poor people, but they're not poor people. They actually have all this property, and they have now facilitated something like a nurses hostel, for the nurses from Kerala who have come, who are working in the hostels, in the kind of hospitals.
Hospitals.
Suddenly you have this hostel for women coming up in an urban village in Gurgaon, and so many potentials, so many possibilities happen. But that's when you start looking at those terms through which the city grows, and one of those terms was also the language. There's Gurgaya, which is something that, because these are migrants coming from all kinds of places, and suddenly coming up, trying to kind of learn a new language, and trying, and there was a newsletter, for Gurgaon, where there were all these terms that you use, like trying to teach the migrants the language.
This is like China. They invent a new word every year and release it every year.
Yeah, so I mean, and what I'm saying is that what is interesting is that these are terms that that people set up for themselves as they grow. There are a lot of potentials within that, and like you said, that even when you talk about an old craft, that old craft is never a kind of puritanical thing. No, it grows, it settles, it's kind of, and exactly the same thing happens here as well. Like there is a settling that is happening, and so that's actually one of the terms that we've also sort of developed for thinking about cities, because in some ways we realize that our own kind of frameworks for thinking of cities are not enough, so we generate these new terms to think of cities through. So settling is one of the terms that in some ways these are that when cities settle, these new terms emerge. And these are kind of ways of negotiation, ways of claiming, ways in which you kind of, maybe not, there will be conflicts, and but these conflicts may not be resolved, but in some ways they are negotiated, and new kinds of spaces get created through these negotiations. And I think it's important to think of that, because unless you understand that these negotiations happen, you will try to resolve the conflict, and when you resolve the conflict, these actually create great polarities. And that's what, when you look around you, all the redevelopment projects are when they're trying to resolve the differences. And so then you see that these become cities of very high polarities, because you have hard boundaries, instead of porous, corroded edges where a series of transactions happen, people are exchanging, and so from there, that's the other term that, along with settling,
Yeah.
we speak about the idea of transactional capacities.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
that urban form has transactional capacities.
Mhm.
So for example, and that's where the map sort of fails completely, because if you look at the map, what appears to be a single line, it's a crisp line, right? Like
Yeah.
you would have lines
Yeah.
for roads and for building boundaries and plot boundaries. But if you look at the city itself, those lines are really not crisp lines. They're corroded lines, they're blurred lines. And within those lines are those series of relationships where one is transacting with the other. And those transactions can be monetary transactions, but there are also transactions of kinship relationships, of security, of exchange, of cultural diversity, and also imagination.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
So, and these transactions are super important for us to live with. And that's if you can develop an urban, and this is where we say, architects need to be cognizant of transactional capacities, and their jobs should be to in some ways facilitate these,
Yeah.
transactional capacities, to increase the transactional capacities,
Mhm.
because these transactional capacities in our new forms of urban renewal are what are being congealed. They're being closed. They're closed down, and that's what is going to create in the future high polarities in society, unless you allow those transactions to happen, to kind of increase the transactional capacities.
Yeah. So okay, I kind of want to just talk about this the invention of, say, new terms and how they are kind of understood. So post independence, there is like a shift towards this idea of modernity, right? Like the first 5 year plan or till whatever time we have this, it's about, okay, now Chandigarh gets made and now we are moving towards a certain sense of an idea of a modern citizen, and there are references being taken from all over the world. And this is being the term that is being used is that we are urging our citizens into modernity, and this is for the development of the country, right? Now in your line of inquiry we see, and then after, of course, 92, there is a second stage of, say, development of the country in terms of or especially in terms of Mumbai as a city, this the emergence of the entrepreneur and things like this. Do you think that the way we've understood development vis-a-vis your line of inquiry, the term development needs like a very serious reconsideration in terms of language? And what are some of the things that we should consider while we are redefining or trying to build a sort of new language of development as a term?
Yeah, it's great. This goes all the way to the World Bank, actually, development economics and all of that with
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right that the idea of development, and it's not only post independence,
Yeah.
but there's a colonial sort of imprint, in
Yeah.
the way we imagined, through kind of modern structural frameworks of thinking of space, of thinking of systems of knowledge, and absolutely right that you require completely different frameworks of thinking, and so some of the examples that I gave you were really about rethinking those frameworks. What we
Yeah.
consider development, may in some ways create very, very deep kind of problems of polarities and other things that happen, and instead, if you look around closely, life is led in many more ways than through those development frameworks. And that's precisely what we were rejecting, 15 years ago when we said, we're working with through conventional logics of the discipline. You realize that you were already asking, you were answering things that you already knew. You were working from the limited frameworks of the imperatives of that discipline, right? So you were really kind of looking at these were creating more problems. But again, the field became really, really important to kind of come back and teach you that there is a problem of thinking like that. That what you need to change is the framework of thinking itself first to begin with. Because even when, we were also working in the kind of space of activism, Even
Yeah.
there, it was really the developmental logic that kind of worked, where you were working with a problem and solution, whereas the problem was somewhere else and the solution was somewhere else altogether.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
think that kind of requires a complete displacement. You need new frameworks of thinking to begin with, because otherwise, what happens? The city becomes a project.
Yeah.
And it's not a project actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to also go back to something you quickly mentioned just before we started recording today, and I inadvertently, or obviously on purpose, I knew what I was doing. Said the word informal, and you said you don't like that word, formal and informal. Could you elaborate for our audiences? I'm really curious because this is also again the development and sort of the thrust for economics. How do you attract capital kind of a problem, the formal and the informal?
Yeah. I mean, again, precisely the problems of saying something is informal and something is formal, because within what we understand as the formal, things work very informally. Things,
Yeah.
financing networks, who knows whom, how things move, how money moves, everything works through very, very informal ways. But it's only certain things that you would call formal and certain things that you call informal, which is why I hate the word informal, because in some ways it creates these deep binaries. It validates some ways of working and invalidates other ways of working. Everything
Yeah.
that we are wearing clothes that have come from certain spaces, certain kind of transactions, everything that our lives are as informal and as formal as anything else, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, I hate like the conversation that we are having, from where these kind of devices have come, all of that are implicated in series of flows and forces which are impossible to delineate as formal and informal. So
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of hate that word, because then you only kind of validate certain things and certain things become in some ways illegal. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
really sort of that's instead you start looking at what are the forces through which things are produced and made. And again, it's really again coming back to the structural logics, right, of modernity in some ways, right? It's the modern plan which made things informal, I would say,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Humanity always built their homes, they built spaces, they built cities, right? It's the modern plan when it came and superimposed itself on this territory, that is when certain things were called formal and informal, legal and illegal, right? So those also come from certain epistemes of thinking,
Yeah.
right? Certain epistemes of knowledge, and that's important to understand, right? Because
Yeah.
otherwise you take things for given and very kind of easily put things into certain kind of categories of kind of knowledge.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's hilarious how every success story in Silicon Valley started from a garage, and it was about a dropout from some big university, and then even in Mumbai it caught on where a lot of people started spending at least a week on Chowpatty in the hopes of becoming Shah Rukh Khan after they arrived in Mumbai, and all of these sort of working in really funny ways in terms of cultural when we say understanding, or the tendency of these terms to inform our biases, very very formally, I would say. um, I also wanted to ask you,
Also
Chirag, did you want?
appropriate, no? I mean, sorry, just to also appropriate, no? Like
Yeah,
when you
Yeah.
say formal, you're only validating certain things. You're saying, this is not that, this is not because I need to own the means of production of this. I need to kind of, make this certain things kind of possible, right? So in some ways, you're also appropriating a whole kind of cultural possibility otherwise through which life is led, no?
Yeah. No, I just wanted to also add that again, I want to go back to the line of inquiry that you take, because I find it very interesting, the the fact that we are talking about these frameworks that need to change, right? Now, of course, such changing of frameworks is going to be constantly met with oppositions, that there is this and no, we will not let you do this, oh, what are you talking about? So through your practice, what are some of these oppositions that you have encountered in your line of inquiry when you kind of start saying we have to change the framework, we have to really look at these things differently, this is not the sort of direction of maps and stats that we need to go for. We need to go for understanding the social life, the culture that it's producing, and those things. So what have been some of the oppositions that you've encountered through the course of this entire, whatever you might call it, 10-15 years of the project?
Yeah. I mean, of course, oppositions will be from, places that have consolidated ways of doing things, right? Like,
Yeah.
because that becomes, a bread and butter for certain things. They become, ways in which, like, for example, you would have, you're implicated within kind of financing networks and everything, which requires certain kind of reproduction, right? You need to
Yeah.
reproduce certain ways of doing things to be able to sit comfortably within that, right?
Yeah.
So there will definitely be series of oppositions and everything. But I think what kind of works is that there are, I mean, like all of these, in some ways, they will not work in some ways, because you
Mhm.
require, all projects are not possible. There's a series of failures, and everybody knows that, right? Like,
Yeah.
you would think that there will be a development project that will happen, but it doesn't happen because of many reasons, because there's not enough money in it, there's not enough power for somebody in it, right? So it's fine for people who are still working on a project mode and continuing to do that. Yeah, but there's a lot of space where things don't work, and that's
Mhm.
where it's important to understand that it's not about things not working, but there are other possibilities, there are alternatives
Yeah.
to kind of thinking of those, and that's where, and that space is actually much larger,
Mhm.
much larger. So I wouldn't say that there is a kind of opposition or anything. Things will go, but it's important to even recognize the fact that if you are working within certain frameworks, you have to understand that those frameworks are not given, that they're coming from somewhere. So I
Yeah.
think these conversations we've had with several people, and with other architects, with other planners, and I think where we continue to have these conversations, and they're very useful dialogues that continue across from across. I mean, and that's what is important. Like, we've been speaking to all kinds of people,
Mhm.
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
all kinds of forums, and so I think these are important, because what they do is they also sharpen ways of working within those disciplines itself also.
Yeah.
Then you don't kind of get congealed into kind of the formula, but it's also possible to shift your ways of working from within those silos also.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's the part of the larger uh, set of negotiations, basically, right? Like, and it's quite a privilege actually to be in that space. Um, so basically, you won't tell us who your sworn enemies are, right? We were hoping we would get a list and then we could do something about it. No, I'm just kidding.